Hey, I want to tell you the story about this old guy that I want to say I knew, but I really didn't know him. But this old guy that I knew of when I was growing up, I think at this time I was maybe 14, 13, 14 when this little story begins. Anyway, the guy's name, I think, was Homer O. Tog. Now that's, I guess, could be pronounced Togue, Togue. Now, the only reason I know the guy's name, or I think I know his name, is because it was on his mailbox. And he lived down the street from us. We lived on a hill, kind of. Well, anyway, there was a road that went down. It was kind of a highway, but it wasn't very busy. It was out in the country, kind of. And so I guess the speed limit was like 45 miles an hour or something like that. So you get the kind of idea what it was. Anyway, so Homer lived down at the bottom of this hill, which I guess was a distance of maybe a couple of city blocks, something like that. Maybe not quite that far. And he lived in this little wooden frame house. It's a small house. And it had lap siding and it was painted white. And he had a little small white picket fence in the front of the yard. And there's a little tiny garage that he had too, and it had a little gate that you could open up and open it, just a hinged kind of a gate, and it was part of that white picket fence. But anyway, I remember Homer used to walk up the hill. He seemed to walk everywhere he went. And he'd walk up that hill and he'd come past our place kind of at the top. And my mother was a widow at the time. And so if she was out in the yard watering the lawn or pulling weeds out of the flower bed or doing something, he'd always stop and talk. And that is another thing I remember about Homer. Boy, was he a talker. And this was well in the days before any kind of talk radio was out there. So maybe that was his way of doing what people do on talk radio when they call in. I don't know. But I remember he'd sit down, and we were kids, but it seemed like whenever I was around or whatever, any of my sisters were around, brother, it was important to him that we listened to him too. Now Homer looked to me like he's definitely retired, but he looked like he's at least in his 60s. And I don't know, for all I know he could have been in his 80s, but he seemed to be in pretty good shape. Now he'd sit down and he'd talk, and he would talk about the latest things that went on in the world or something like that. And he had a funny way of talking, and I remember he would make a point that something was important or whatever it was, and then he would tell his little story, and then he would make a point and he'd go, "Yeah, see?" or something like that. And he would kind of talk that way with a big crescendo after the tailing end of his "yeah." It's just a funny guy. Anyway, the reason I remember, well, there's another guy. Before I get into that. There was another guy that lived right next door to him. And same kind of house, same size yard, and, the wooden siding that was painted white, and it was lap siding. Only his name was Fred. Now, I don't think those two guys really chummed around or were friends with each other or whatever. It seemed to me more, from my observation, of that Fred was just there, and it was, you don't bother me, I don't bother you, we'll get along just fine. It seemed to me that was kind of the relationship. I don't know if it was, but when I'd ride my bike past their little house, those two houses, they were very close to the street. That seemed to me that from observation, that's kind of how it was. Now Fred, he never talked to us, but what I remember about him is he had this old green oxidized Chevy truck, and I think it was probably in the mid 50s vintage. It was a 55 or something like that, Chevrolet truck. Green, and it looked like it had never seen a garage or polish or nothing. It was just oxidized. And I remember you could tell Fred was coming from behind. When I was riding my bicycle, if I was going from my house down that hill, I could always tell Fred was coming without even looking back, because the truck he had, well, first of all, he drove on the side of the road, way on the side, with one tire, off the edge of the road, which is where I was riding my bike. But you could, and he went 20 miles an hour. So you could tell he was coming by the awful rattling noise that truck made. But it was a familiar rattling noise, and every bump he hit, it was the same bump. And after being ahead of him several times, you could really absolutely predict where he was behind you just from the noise that you heard and the bumps that he went over. So anyway, I'd go on and Fred would pull into his yard. Now, Fred had a horse, and it was an old horse, and he just had a little spot in his backyard there where he had a little tiny barn. It was enough for a little shelter. I think it was just a lean-to kind of thing, a little shelter for the horse and a place to feed him. And he had a little bit of an area just to walk around a bit, but that was it. Now, the horse did get plenty of exercise, because Fred would saddle him up just about every day, and then he would take him out and go for a ride on his horse up that hill to our house and go past our house. And I don't know where he went, but I know that he was gone usually for about an hour and a half. Then he'd come back and unsaddle the horse. Now, the way Fred rode that horse was quite a sight. Now, Fred looked to me like he was about as old as Homer was. Maybe he was older, for all I know. And he would sit in that horse right on the shoulder of the road, and, just at a slow, not a gallop, but not even a trot, but just walking along. The horse was going slow. But he would be leaning way over to one side, and he would hold the reins with just one hand. And it looked like any minute he's going to fall out of the saddle as he comes down on the horse. And, the horse is rocking back and forth a little. And it looked like he's going to fall out of there. But he never did. And I suppose he got that way. He rode the horse that way because maybe he had a stroke a few years back. And so that's what caused him to ride that way. But he never did fall off the horse. And I remember thinking one time that the horse and Fred were kind of like friends, I guess, because they each had nobody, and they were kind of an understanding between the horse and Fred that they were both old and they were both friends, and they both had nobody else, so they tolerated each other, or they were friends with each other. That's kind of how it looked to me. Well, anyway, the reason I remember these two guys was because the area that I lived in at the time was beginning a transformation to a very rural area into a commercial area. And now Fred and Homer, they lived next to this big field that this other farmer, I think his name was Johnson, had. And they lived right up on the road, and then there was this big field that continued on, and he grew wheat and whatever in that field, and hay and stuff like that. Well, anyway, one year there was rumors that the Kmart company was going to build a store down there in that field. And as those rumors started flying, I remember Fred would come up, and he would, in his little talks to us, he'd sit up there, and I remember him saying, "Yeah, everybody in the whole world is going to come shopping at that place, and the traffic is going to be just terrible." And he would go on and on about that, and then he would go on his way wherever it was he was going. So, but he did tell us that he had plans that he was going to sell his place and get a lot of money for it, and then move on somewhere else and live happily ever after. Well, anyway, as time went on, the Kmart outfit did build a store down there. It was a big one, and it had a food store on one side and the Kmart discount store on the other side, and an auto repair center. And I don't know. I guess the whole place took up 40 acres or something like that. It was quite a large tract of land that they bought from the old farmer and built that on. But now, Fred and Homer's fence that used to be right along that field where he used to raise hay and stuff, now that was where you turned in and went into the parking lot of Kmart, and you drive along the fence, and right along that fence line there was parking parking lines that were drawn, so you could park there right along the fence. Now, Fred and Homer really couldn't do anything about it. The thing was built, and they didn't like it. Neither one of them liked it. I'm pretty sure Fred didn't like it, because that just destroyed his whole lifestyle. See, he used to be able to go back and feed his horse or do whatever, and he could have gone back there naked, and nobody would have noticed. But now, every time he goes back there to feed his horse or saddle him up or something like that, he's on display. And people driving by, or people parked near the fence, or walking around down there. This is something they didn't see very often. An old man with an old horse, saddling him up or feeding him or whatever. And to them, the old man looked like he should have been in a nursing home. So you don't know what they thought. And I remember, as part of this, after the building went up, Homer started acting a little strange, doing some strange things, and he didn't stop in to talk to us as often as he used to. But I remember one day he got a piece of plywood, a 4x8 foot piece of plywood, and he painted it white, and then with black letters he drew in large letters the words "Senior Citizens," and he spelled the word "citizen" wrong, and he also had the Z backwards. But anyway, he put that sign on display right there in his driveway, right in his front yard. And I don't know what he meant by it. Maybe it was a protest that he's being treated as a forgotten person or something. I don't know. But anyway, when I went down to past his house, you could see it. And I think a lot of people probably thought some crazy old coot put that sign up and spelled it wrong. And really, if they noticed it, they didn't say much more than that or think much more than that. But, when the Kmart store did get built, I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was great. And because it had, you could go down there and go shopping and get anything. And it was just a couple of blocks away. You could get clothes and food and anything you wanted. And one more thing that you could get that I got is I turned 16 about not too long after it was built, and I got a job at Kmart. I worked in the food store, and I was a bagger and so forth. Just a kid, 16 years old, but I got a job, so I thought that was pretty good stuff down there. Now, but as time went on, and I learned to drive, and I got a driver's license, we stopped seeing Homer. He never stopped in to talk anymore. And Fred, you didn't see him much anymore at all either. And I used to just see him either driving his truck, that rattly old truck, or riding his horse up and down the road. But now what you'd see when you see him out there is if he's either in his truck or, if he was in his truck especially, you'd see he would be going 20 miles an hour, like I said. And it was a 40 or 45 mile an hour street. And now, because of the store down there was a lot of traffic. And he would back up the traffic, and people would have to go around him, and they'd be honking the horns, and they'd flip him off, some of them, as they got past him. And I think, life had changed for him. And riding his horse, he always rode on the shoulder of the road, of course, but even the horse and him, now there was busy traffic next to him. So things weren't the same anymore. And after a while, a couple of years after I'd worked there, maybe a year and a half, it seemed kind of obvious that Homer and Fred just weren't there anymore. They were gone. And I surmised that because, I didn't see him anymore when I went to work at Kmart. Didn't see him out there, and I'd drive past him. And usually you'd see somebody, some activity, like Fred feeding the horse or something. But the horse was gone, and Fred was gone, and the truck was gone. And Homer, I just didn't see him anymore. They looked like they were gone, but the houses were still there. And then not too long after that, they started tearing the houses down, the two houses, and a storage unit was built down there. And, when I looked at that, I thought it was kind of sad because now Homer was gone, and so was Fred. They'd just been erased. And I felt kind of, sad about that because, I knew who these guys were. I'd talked to Homer and I'd seen Fred. It was kind of like they were guys in the neighborhood that I knew, and now they had just evaporated. They were gone, and the neighborhood had changed, and there was no farewell, or they just sort of disappeared. And now they were completely forgotten, and no one else probably that ever drove by there even knew they were ever there. And I thought about that for sometimes off and on for a while, and I thought, that's kind of how life is for some people. It's like you go for a hike in the woods, and as you're walking along, you leave footprints. And when you're all done, it doesn't take long for the footprints to be covered up or just be gone. And the next people that hike in the woods never knew that you were even there. And you, as far as they're concerned, the animals and other people, you were never there because there's never anything left that you did that would show that you were there, or nobody knew you or something like that. And that's kind of sad. I think some people, that's how their life is. They live it and they're gone, and nobody remembers them, nobody cares, nobody does nothing. But not to end this on a sad note, but I think that's kind of incumbent upon each one of us to do something to have people remember you. Whether you do nice things for people in your neighborhood, or whether you have a nice family and your family remembers you, or you do something in the community where people remember who you are, at least for a little while. That's what each of us should probably do, is try and leave something of a legacy so that you're not just gone.